Well, good evening, everybody. My name is Liz Butler, and I'm one of the Exeter Alumnae Group, and I'm sharing this evening. This is our first attempt of doing a webinar like this, so please bear with us if we get it completely wrong. I'm relieved to say that we have Georgie in the background, so if a disembodied voice gets involved, it's because I've got this completely and utterly wrong, and I'll apologise in advance just in case I do. I thought it'd be useful just to let you know what the Alumnae Group is, and we're a group of female alumnae, although we do let alumni join the Alumnae Group on LinkedIn. They might be a little surprised when they join and realise what they've joined, but we are an open group. We came together really because the university realised that they weren't attracting female graduates to their alumni programme. And we stepped into this gap to try and give a little bit more linkage for female graduates back to the university. We're a Bolshie group and we do pretty much what we want. And our main aim is really to support female graduates at key points in their working lives, either at their first job, at career change, return to work, and the exec to non-exec transitions, and I guess at any point in between. In normal times, we have really nice events, normally at the University Women's Club, which are great fun. We're trying this online approach to see if we can make continue in these really rather peculiar times. I should also say at this point that the committee is always open to new members, and if you want to get in touch, please do, because you'd be made very, very welcome. So tonight we're starting our series of webinars, and I think the title couldn't be more apt given just how strange an environment we're currently in. We have two fabulous speakers tonight. I won't go through their CVs because that would take our whole time. You have seen them on the booking forms, both amazing alumnae from our university, and they will be speaking to us, and there'll be plenty of opportunity for you to ask questions. You should be able to see the question box on your screen. You won't be able to speak, but I will act as your voice and pose the questions. I shall take chair's privilege and cluster questions if they seem to be similar. So you might not hear your words verbatim, but the sense, I hope, will be conveyed. Plenty of time for questions afterwards, but we have, first of all, speaking to us, Annie Coleman. Annie has an amazing CV as an exec coach, as founder of Cerebellum Partners, I keep forgetting, and as a non-executive. But I'm not going to speak anymore. I shall hand over to Annie. And please fire away, Annie.
Great, thank you very much, Liz. And hi, everybody. Delighted to have this opportunity to speak with you today. This is going to be sort of two parts, really. I'm going to talk particularly about what happens in the brain and the body when we get stressed and how we can build a little bit of resilience. But Anna's going to focus also particularly on some of her amazing adventures that she's done, so some amazing challenges that she's taken, and how she's also built resilience, and she's also using that as her master. So I'm really looking forward to hearing more about that too. Just but quickly, my background's very much in financial services, and I suffered a lot of stress when I worked at Goldman Sachs for 8 years, and more latterly at UBS, which I left in March. And by trial and error, I've kind of like dealt with challenges and built resilience. But one of the things that always I was fascinated by was, well, what's actually happening in my brain and my body when I get stressed. I can see some of the symptoms, but what's really going on and why am I reacting this way? And I left UBS in March because I wanted to have a new way of working, which is my consultancy. But I've also been studying applied neuroscience. And one of the things that we have looked at is actually stress and resilience. And so I thought I'd share some of the things that I have learned on this course about what's really going on in the brain and the body, because I think that's fascinating. And if we can understand, I think, what the brain's doing, we can then also understand how that impacts our behavior, and then really impact our behaviour in terms of affecting us as individuals, teams, or organisations. But before we start, I think it would be quite nice just to do a little level set and ask you all a couple of questions. So, Georgia, if we can have the questions. The first one I'd like to ask you is, how much stress have you experienced in your life over the last year, sort of on a scale of 0 being the least and the higher figure being the most? So if you could just put that into the poll now, and then we can actually see what the results are. So just select one of those. And Georgia, do we have the results of that? So there we go, quite a bit or a lot of stress. So, you know, 77% saying yes, not surprising given the current environment that we're in. So yes, so can we go to the next question, which is, do you think stress is harmful to your health? Okay, so if we can have maybe the results of that, Georgia. So 96% of you think stress is harmful to your health. No, 1%. I'm not sure, 3%. Really interesting. Really interesting. There was a reason for that. It's quite interesting just to hear where we all are. And again, not surprised at the levels of stress. I think we all feel that. I know I certainly do too. But what's really interesting is that those two questions have been part of a study that's been done in the US. It's about 12 years ago. And 30,000 adults in the US were asked those two same questions. And what was really interesting was that those who suffered the most stress, so probably the 77% that we just seen here, they had a 43% increased risk of dying over the decade. But what was fascinating was that this only applied to those people who thought that stress was harmful to their health. Those people who didn't think stress was harmful to their health had the lowest mortality rate out of everybody. So what's fascinating about this is that it's not so much perhaps the stressful events in itself, but our perception of how bad they are for us that can have actually quite an influence over whether stress really does do us harm or not. And that's something I'm going to explore a little bit more. But the good thing about that is that it suggests too that if we can change our perception about stress, our mindset about stress, we can perhaps reduce some of the symptoms that we experience and actually not have so much of the negative effects that if you really do think it's bad for your health and you really are having a lot of stress, you will feel them. But we do have the ability to change our attitude on and how our brain deals with it, and therefore change the physical responses that we have in our bodies. And I hope that's one of the things that we can all take away and feel a bit happy about at the end of today's session. So maybe we should just start off by saying, getting a definition of stress so that we're all on the same page as to what we mean. And one of the best descriptions that I've come across stress is that it's the consequences of the failure of an organism, because it's not just humans, but of an organism to respond adequately to mental, emotional, or physical demands, whether actual or perceived. And the actual perceived bit, again, is quite important. And so it's whether we have that flight response. And really, if we think about stress, we all have very different reactions to it. So what I might find stressful, all of you on this webinar might actually not find stressful at all. So I think I've read several times that, you know, there are many people who find standing up to give a presentation in front of a group of strangers, you know, more frightening than the prospect of death. There are some people who think a bungee jump would just be the most horrific, most stressful thing that they could possibly do. I personally, if you asked me to have to work out a mathematical puzzle in public in front of people, I would find that the most stressful thing, because I have a belief that I'm not very good at maths, for example. So we all have different things that we find stressful, which again tends to suggest that it's not so much the event itself, but the way that we react to that stress that is actually the thing that's different. I mean, clearly there are certain things like, you know, death, divorce, certain common things that we all find stressful, but a lot of things in our day-to-day lives we have very different reactions to as individuals. And the other thing that's also different too is our ability to handle so much stress. I mean, I've got a girlfriend who, you know, she's managed to change partners, change jobs, move house, and really just seems to sail through it, never seems to show any stress at all. Whereas to me, that would just be off the scale in terms of what she had to handle. And then we all know people too, who the most simple little thing can really just kind of set them off for some reason. So our ability to kind of handle a load of stress is also very different. And so again, that tends to suggest that it's not the events themselves so much, but how we react to them, and our beliefs and mindset about our ability to deal with the stress is really what it lies at a lot of all of this. And the organ that really controls our response to stress, perceived stress, is our brain. It assesses the potential risks and determines the best response. And I think it's worth just looking at what our brain's purpose is. Our brain's purpose is our actual survival. It's there to keep us alive. And that's its primary purpose above all else. It's our survival. And so what it's constantly doing, what it's hardwired to do, is to avoid any kind of threats and move towards things that are rewards. But because the threats are much more sort of prevalent, we're much more sensitized to always being vigilant for threats than we are to moving towards the rewards. And again, that's just hardwired into our evolutionary system. And so there is a part of the brain called the amygdala. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of it. And basically its role is to detect threats in our environment, to be observant of fears in other people, and to activate our defense system. And as I said, we're much more sensitized to that sort of negative stuff than we are the positive stuff. It's why, for example, when you get a performance review, you know, you never remember the good feedback, do you? You always remember the bad stuff. And it's why our news broadcasters, you know, it's always bad news when it comes to the news, because that's, they know, is what people are sensitized to. That's what people are going to really be drawn to and react to. So as I say, it's the amygdala, it's that part of the brain that basically is the threat detector, looks at fears in others, and really activates that defense system. And it really evolved during a time when human survival was life or death. You know, when we think back to our earliest evolutionary species, you know, it really was about water, it was about food, and it was about fighting off other tribes or animals that might kill us. And our stress mechanism was designed really to help us in that situation. And stress in those situations is really positive, and I'll go on to explain why. It really helps us in those situations. The problem is that we've become much more civilized, much more safe today. And as a result, we still have exactly the same hardwired system as we had way back then, but we don't have the same kind of stresses and the same life or death situations. And so what's happened is that our perception of stress has evolved as we have evolved as human beings. And now much more minor things can set off that stress system in a way that, again, can be helpful, but if it goes on for too long, can be unhelpful. But they're not live or die sort of situations, but the system is still the same. But again, I think that's quite interesting, because you know, it provides hope that since we understand that our stress response depends upon our perception of the event rather than the event itself, we have the potential to change our stress response and build resilience. Now, Georgia, I don't know if we've got that image that I sent over earlier, if we could possibly have that up on the screen at the moment.
I'm sorry, Annie, we don't have that to hand.
Okay, don't worry. So was going to show you a diagram that actually showed what happens, but I can talk you through it. It's not a problem. So as I said, the brain is the primary organ that deals with stress. So what happens is the amygdala, this part of the brain that is the threat detector, it perceives a stress. It may be real, it may just be a perception. And what happens is that it basically activates a part of the brain called the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus is one of the chemical factories in the brain. And the hypothalamus gets activated and it releases this particular neurotransmitter, which also activates our pituitary gland, which is also another kind of chemical little factory in the brain. And the hypothalamus really deals with the neurotransmitters that help kind of fire up different parts of the brain that we want to fire up in response. And the pituitary gland basically fires up our hormones, which basically deal with the physical response that we need when we have a stressful situation. So what happens is that the hypothalamus, it does the neurotransmitter, it sends out two neurotransmitters, noradrenaline and also serotonin. Now, there are two parts of the brains that are particularly sensitive to the reception of those two new neurotransmitters. And one of them is the prefrontal cortex. This is the front part of the brain, often referred to as the executive brain. And that part of the brain deals with our decision making, our planning, our weighing up the options, our weighing up the risks. So when we have a stress, that's the part of the brain we really want firing on all four cylinders, because we've got to make decisions in like milliseconds. And then it also releases serotonin, which is another neurotransmitter, which also helps fire up that executive brain, prefrontal cortex, but it also helps fire up our hippocampus. And our hippocampus is where we keep all our long-term memory. And we really want that fired up because we don't want to be scrabbling around looking in the filing cabinets of our memories to try and recall when something similar happened to the stressful event that's happening to us right now. We ought to be able to literally get right to that past experience. What worked for us then? What didn't work for us then? What can we apply in this particular situation? So those neurotransmitters are really helpful because they really sort of like, put a rocket up those two parts of the brain that really help our cognitive reasoning, help us really deal with the situation, and also help us access the experience that's going to help us deal. And this all happens in like milliseconds. So that's what goes on in the sort of the brain, but the body also has to be able to fight or flight, depending what we're going to do. So the pituitary gland basically releases the hormone adrenaline, and the adrenaline is really helpful because that enables our heartbeat to increase, our blood pressure to increase, but it pumps the blood more efficiently around our body. It gets us to those limbs that we're going to need to use. It also enables our pupils to dilate, so we've got this perfect as vision as possible as we can. It also helps us have more strength in our bodies too, so we just become much more strong in how we can react to things. It's a really, really helpful thing to have to enable our bodies to have the physical wherewithal to deal with the stress. So all of that actually is really, really helpful. So when you have a stressful moment, it's actually, I think, quite useful for me anyway, to think that all of that's going on and that's all helping me. It's helping me be smarter in the way I'm thinking about something. It's helping me draw on the right experience quickly. And whilst I probably don't need the physical aspects so much, because usually it's a cognitive problem like having to give a presentation to somebody or something else, it's all quite helpful. But our bodies are basically a homeostatic system, so they always have to go back into balance. And so when you have this surge of hormones and neurotransmitters, the body's also looking for ways that it can bring it back into balance again, because you don't want to have all those hormones and neurotransmitters elevated for long periods of time. And that's not how the brain was designed, the system was designed to deal with stress. So what happens is that the sympathetic nervous system, which is all about, wants to get back into balance. And so what happens is the pituitary gland then releases cortisol. And cortisol, which comes from the adrenal glands, which is the same where adrenaline comes from, but cortisol basically has the impact of dampening down those neurotransmitters. So it dampens down the serotonin, it dampens down the neuroadrenaline, and it dampens down the adrenaline. So your body can get back into some kind of balance again. Now, depending on the level of stress will depend how much you have of all those hormones and neurotransmitters coursing through your system, and how fast and how challenging it is for your system to get back into balance. Now, again, some people who have got perhaps more resilience because they've learned to overcome challenges, and we can come back to that, they have a system that can actually deal with quite a high load of stress, a high load of these neurotransmitters and hormones, but their system is used to it and it can get it into balance really quickly. And that's what you really want. That's a really high functioning way that the body can deal with stress, and a really useful response. What can happen though is that the stress goes on for a prolonged period of time and the body struggles to get it back into balance. And then when you have too much noradrenaline and too much serotonin, that's when you get anxiety. That's when actually you can get cognitive impairment. So the opposite starts to happen. You don't actually think as clearly and concisely. You find it harder to access those memories that you had that would be useful. Too much adrenaline can raise your blood pressure too high for too long. Cortisol actually was also designed to make the body want to replenish itself, get energy, because if you've just fought the tiger or, run 1,000 miles to get away from it, you need to replenish the body. But if you have elevated levels of cortisol, that can actually make you want to overeat, which can sometimes be the problem when you have cortisol. And again, it can lead to anxiety. So what we don't want is the body to be in this status for any prolonged period of time. But we can, as I say, build up our resilience, and the system can learn to deal with quite high levels of stress, but be able to bring the body back into balance again much more quickly. And that's really what we want to try and do in terms of managing our stress levels. So the brain definitely has the necessary mechanisms to deal with stress effectively, and it can be really helpful, so long as it's not overly prolonged and it's not too heavy a load. And what really impacts that in many ways is, as I say, our mindset towards stress and how we think about things. And I'm sure Anna's going to say more about this, but if we see challenges as opportunities to grow, we can use the helpful parts of that stress mechanism. If we see failure as a way that we can learn, again, we're going to have a different response than if perhaps we see a stressful event or a challenge as being threatening, or failure as being somehow a devastating indication that we're not very good at something. So that mindset plays a very critical part. And there are a number of other things that you can also do to help get that sort of stress mechanism back into more balance. But I'm going to leave it there because I think it would be interesting now, Liz, for Anna to perhaps talk about her particular experiences and how she's used her challenges to build that resilience, and what her studying about that has led her to conclude.
Annie, that was absolutely fascinating, completely compelling. We never have enough time with these events, but that's given us a taste of what you've been absorbed with. Anna, I think you're going to give us a practical example or two, so I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Yes, yeah, I am. And that was really interesting hearing about the neuropsychology and the theories behind some of the more practical applications that I am going to talk about. So I just introduced myself a bit. I'm an adventurer, writer, photographer, and a speaker. Over the last, I think it's probably 7 years now, I've been on a number of pretty big adventures, including kayaking from London to the Black Sea in Romania in 2018 with my friend Kate, which involved paddling over 4,000 kilometers through 11 countries and 5 capital cities across Europe in a tandem kayak, as you can see here, which took us 5 months to complete. And I'll probably refer to this the most when I talk about my experiences later on, as this trip posed possibly the most challenges of any trip that I've attempted. In addition to that, last year I spent almost 3 months trekking just over 1,000 kilometers across Arctic and Northern Scandinavia by myself. This involved carrying up to about 30 kilos, trekking and wild camping in often sub-zero temperatures, and spending up to 10 days completely solo, not seeing a single person, just a lot of reindeer. I've also walked about 1,600 kilometers, 1,000 miles across France and Spain by myself. You may notice a theme emerging. I quite like solo expeditions, solo adventures. And a big reason for that is that I take on these adventures for personal growth. I do them to challenge myself, push myself outside of my comfort zone, physically and mentally, as well as to experiencing the incredible, often remote environments that these adventures take me through. So alongside that, I'm particularly interested in how adventures or expeditions like these facilitate personal growth and positive wellbeing outcomes. I've just completed a master's with the University of Exeter, and I was lucky enough to be able to research this for my dissertation, which I literally submitted last week, so this is very, very fresh for me. Specifically, my research was around how self-supported adventures, like the ones I do, how they shape resilience. I was interested in what factors adventurers perceived as being key to the development of resilience, how they dealt with challenge, the sorts of challenges they faced, and the applicability of that resilience to everyday non-adventure life as well. Just to quickly define resilience, because it can be defined and interpreted in a lot of different ways. When I speak about it, I'm referring to, firstly, the idea of being able to effectively cope with challenge. Secondly, being able to bounce back from that challenge. And thirdly, being able to experience personal growth or reward through dealing with that adversity. So increased resilience isn't the only outcome of adventure. There's plenty of research linking adventure experiences to self-confidence, a sense of empowerment, greater problem-solving abilities, self-efficacy, which is basically your confidence in your ability to successfully complete the task. And again, it's not just the major expeditions, the major solo self-supported trips. These effects have been found in a range of adventure settings, from a few days of an adventure education program for teenagers, young adults, university students, through to gap year challenges or guided treks and adventures, all sorts of things. And the idea is that through these outcomes are achieved through engaging with challenge, hopefully successfully, and being outside of your comfort zone, all those sorts of things. So I thought I would tell you a bit more about some of the challenges faced on adventures, and the strategies that are developed in order to successfully overcome them, which basically enables people to thrive in some fairly extreme circumstances. This is coming from a combination of my own experience on adventures, but also from the interviews that I conducted for my research. I also just wanted to note that all of the adventurers that I interviewed, they fully believed that the experiences they had on their adventures, the skills, the strategies, the resilience they developed, they believe that all of that relates to their non-adventure lives as well. So the strategies I'm going to outline now are relevant to a broader set of scenarios than those faced on the expeditions. So hopefully there is something useful in this for you as well. So my research identified two broad categories of strategies or ways of dealing with challenge, and those were proactivity and purposeful acceptance. Get my words out. I'll expand on those in a moment, but briefly, a third very relevant factor that emerged was also the adventurers' mindsets and attitudes towards challenge, as Annie just mentioned, their ability to frame challenge in a positive light or to glean some sort of reward or learning from it. So the strategies, I'm going to start with proactivity. This is possibly the more obvious group. So by proactivity, I'm referring to responses to challenge which involve clear, decisive action, clear sort of steps to overcoming a challenge. So I've got some examples here. So firstly, analysing and problem solving. To give an adventure example, on the kayaking expedition across Europe with Kate a few years ago, we had a lot of things go wrong, especially equipment failure. And one of these situations arose when we managed to crack our kayak so severely that it was filling with water and we were literally sinking in the middle of the Danube in Austria. Not an ideal situation to be in. So we very quickly had to work out what steps needed to be taken in order for us to get back on the water and continue on our trip. And this started with actually getting the kayak out of the water so that we didn't literally sink. Finding help from people to carry the kayak to the nearest yacht club, finding someone who was able to repair the damage, being able to break down that and work out different options for moving forward. That was something we became very good at on that trip because we had these sorts of situations on a near daily basis, I think. And then teamwork. If you're already part of a team, use those people. And if not, don't be afraid to rope other people in if you can. I've just mentioned that we had to get help from people when we were sinking. And the reality of that expedition is that it wouldn't have been possible without the dozens of people who helped us. And that's right from Kate and I coming up with the idea to go and kayak across Europe, through to the people that we met along the way who spontaneously offered hospitality or food, or helped us repair our kayak, or lent us equipment when the kit broke. So it was very much a team effort in that respect. And also down to me and Kate as well, my kayaking partner. We very quickly had to learn how to work together in very close proximity, and I mean that very literally, because we were sharing a tent and a kayak for the first 2.5 months of the trip, and even for the second 2.5 months we were in tents right next to each other, so constantly together. We had to learn how to use that to our advantage. Then there's this idea of just crack on. Sometimes this is just the best approach to take with a challenge. It was quite entertaining how many of the adventurers I interviewed for my research at some point in their interview were describing a challenge or some sort of logistical thing, like there'd been rockfall on the road they were trying to cycle along and they had to climb up a mountain instead, and their response to this was, oh yeah, well, we just cracked on, we just got on with it. So sometimes you can't, it's best to just not overcomplicate or overthink things. You have literally just got to crack on with it. And then creative strategies, and I find it really interesting hearing other people talk about the things that they do, and it made me realise the sorts of strategies I have. And these particularly came into action when people were facing like a lack of motivation, when they were tired, things like that. So visualization, and this went in two very contrasting directions. First, we were visualizing the worst potential outcomes, the biggest things that could go wrong in that particularly challenging situation that you're facing. One of the people that I interviewed, she talked about how on her paddleboarding expedition, at one point, she was about to launch her paddleboard onto quite a big stretch of open sea, which was going to be almost 24 hours of paddling, and she was launching at night. So she had this big stretch in the dark. And her sort of visualization there was she thought about all of the things that could possibly go wrong in order to prepare plans, basically. So the other side of visualization, the more sort of, I think, commonly talked about side of it, is visualizing yourself succeeding, picturing in your head you reaching the end point or accomplishing whatever it is that you set out to accomplish. Another creative strategy is self-dialogue, and anyone who's been on a big expedition or adventure will probably have done this, and you literally just talk to yourself. And talking from personal experience, sometimes that is literally out loud. But I personally do this when I am lacking in motivation. The trek that I did last year, I had quite a lot of bad weather on it, or days where I was just tired, I just wasn't in the mood for it. And this is where I really used self-dialogue. So I would have a conversation with myself, reminding myself why I was doing that trek, and reminding myself that I was the one who had got myself onto that mountainside, onto that remote tundra in the middle of nowhere, and that actually I had chosen to do that. And that sort of self-dialogue helped pick up my motivation and get through that mental challenge. And interestingly, the adventurers that I interviewed, quite a few of them also talked about using self-dialogue when they had like an injury or a bit of a physical niggle building up. So that maybe, you know, they're getting really bad blisters, or their knee is giving them a lot of grief. And in the evenings, they would sit in their tent and sort of give that niggle or give that knee a bit of a pep talk. And by doing that, I suppose they almost were taking control of that that challenge. Distraction and mental games. Again, these are quite creative ways of engaging with challenge. Things like listening to music or podcasts, or my preference is using the environment around me. So focusing on features of the landscape and really immersing myself in where I am in order to take my mind off whatever the challenges that I'm facing, whether that is blisters or my rucksack is really heavy, or motivation is just not there that day. Food, I'm not going to elaborate on this too much. It's probably one that people are familiar with, but everything is worse on an empty stomach. And it's amazing how powerful it is just getting your blood sugar levels back up, and taking a short break to refuel or regroup can really work wonders. And then the final aspect of proactivity is preparation. And this is the idea of mitigating against potential failure, which thereby allows you to approach a challenge or unfamiliar circumstances with more of a positive attitude. So for example, with the kayaking expedition, we had our whole route planned out. We had trained rigorously. We knew which countries required more elaborate border crossings. We had done kayaking courses, first aid courses. We knew which stretches of river were going to be more rural and would therefore need more food. We knew where there were going to be locks, all those sorts of things, and having that that sort of comfort, knowing that we had prepared ourselves, meant that we could, you know, set off from London, knowing that actually we had given ourselves a pretty good chance at succeeding. And then the second group of strategies I ended up calling Purposeful Acceptance. And these, the idea of these ones is that it's for situations that are outside of your control. So you can't necessarily take action in quite the same way. You have to accept the situation in a pragmatic way rather than resigning yourself to it or accepting defeat. So first of all, Geordie, if we could just change to the next slide. Thank you. It's important to be able to recognise situations that are beyond your control, and then learn to accept them. So putting this in an expedition context, the trek that I did last year, when I say that had a lot of bad weather, I mean it rained almost constantly for weeks on end, to the extent that the ground that I was walking on was essentially just marshes, and it was so wet that I would have water coming in over the tops of my boots. So my socks and my feet and my boots were wet pretty much every day for, you know, a week or 2 weeks at a time, because I was in a tent. It was pretty cold, so there was no opportunity to dry my socks or boots until I next reached civilization, which could be, you know, a couple of weeks. Now, there was nothing that I could do directly to change that situation. I only had 2 or 3 pairs of socks. One of those had to stay dry for the evening. So I had to learn to accept that situation, to make my peace with it. I could have constantly tried to battle against it. I could have been miserable about the fact that my feet and my socks were so wet so much of the time, but that wouldn't have achieved anything other than making sure I had a pretty grim time, which I think would be a big waste of the trip. So the idea being, if you can't control a situation, don't waste your energy stressing about it. Find something positive to focus on, even if that has to be something not directly related to the challenge, you know. And I know that is easier said than done, but I think that, like with any habit, it is something that you can teach yourself. Kind of along the same lines as this idea is giving it time. Learning to wait, giving a situation time to resolve itself, You know, if you're having a rough day, or you're stuck stomping through marshes, that's not a permanent situation. Things are going to get better at some point. You just have to allow that situation some time to figure itself out before you get really, really worked up about it. So just learning to sit with it for the time being, just accept that challenge as it is, that state of being quite uncomfortable. The final element of the sort of idea of purposeful acceptance is self-care. I think it's important to keep an eye on how you're doing, knowing when you need to take time out to have a rest or a snack, knowing if you need to like massage those aches and pains. And I do mean that like literally in terms of physically massaging your aches and pains or having a rest, but I think that kind of does apply to a broader sense in your mental well-being as well. And I think this brings us back to the idea of what we mean by resilience. It isn't about this constant, relentless toughness and this go, go, go. Being resilient requires a bit of softness. It requires understanding what you need in order to be able to overcome a challenge without completely wearing yourself down. The idea is that there's potential for your post-challenge state to be an improvement of where you were pre-challenge, rather than just an exhausted, crumpled heap, basically. So yeah, that's all I've got to say for now.
Fabulous, Anna. Thank you so much for that. For some reason, my webcam has just turned itself off, but yeah, I'm back again. Apologies, I did warn you. Two incredibly insightful presentations. Everybody, lots of chance now to ask questions. We have a question box on your right-hand side, I hope. You might be used to other forums where you put it in chat. It's much easier if you can use the question box and we can keep track. But please feel free to ask questions. I'm going to take the opportunity to ask the question. You talked about the inner dialogue or the self-dialogue, Anna, and I always thought that was me and the route to madness. But how do you make sure that that dialogue is constructive, not destructive?
I think this is one of those things that you have to teach yourself, really. You have to be very mindful of the thoughts you're allowing yourself to have, basically. I mean, I talk about that positive self-dialogue, but I definitely have a lot of negative self-dialogue at the same time, particularly when I'm tired and hungry. It's not a good combination for me at all. So I have learned to recognize that if I'm giving myself a lot of grief over something, or if I'm being overly critical, or like that motivation is really low, my first step is to work out, am I tired? Am I hungry? And is that why I'm sort of having this this inner dialogue going on? So the quick fix is to have a snack. Anyone who knows me will know that food is very important to me. And then just taking that time to try and work out why I'm being negative, and if actually there is something constructive that I can use from that, whether I can sort of channel that into fixing whatever it is that is causing that that negativity, and if it is just because I'm in a bad mood, then either just accepting that, or just trying to make myself snap out of it. But sometimes if you're having an off day and you're in a bad mood, you know, you just have to roll with that. There's no point wasting energy trying to get yourself out of a rut every single time.
Excellent, thank you. Now we've got a question from Carla, and oh dear, I've now lost it, having said I was going to ask it. There we go. And it's a question for Annie, and whether there is, sorry, I've got a tiny box which is almost impossible to read, but the question was, whether there is a link between stress, prolonged stress, and apathy.
Interesting, actually. Definitely, if you have prolonged stress for an over period of time, you can get depression, actually. So what tends to happen is you get over anxious, but over the long term, yes, apathy, which is another aspect of depression, can actually come about. So yes, long-term stress over a prolonged period of time can lead to that. And it's interesting what Anna was just saying too. You know, sometimes when we hear this negative voice, this rumination that grows on. How often have you been? And it happens to me. You know, you wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning, and you know you just got the same thoughts going round and round and round and round in your head. And actually, one of the best things to stop that rumination is to actually do something physically active. So a friend of mine was having a terrible court case, and he was just getting so distressed, and he knocked over a bag full of paper clips, and he picked up one paper clip from the floor and put it on his desk, and he thought, I can do that. And he picked up another paper clip and did that, and actually it just shifts where the brain's focus is. So he suddenly started doing something that was kind of like an activity, and that can break the pattern of the rumination. And that's something that's really useful to do, because ruminating really can lead down that path of anxiety and depression. So yes, is the short answer to the question.
And there's a follow-up to that came through, which is the stressful situations playing out in the middle of the night and keeping people awake, where perhaps picking up paper clips isn't the answer.
But distracting yourself in some way. So what you want to try, it's a, I mean, I won't go into the detail, but there is a pattern that goes on in the brain, and what you want to do is try and shift that pattern. So the best thing you can do is to either, you might want to read a book, or you might want to just get up and have a glass of water, but you just need to do something that just breaks that rumination, because otherwise if you just lie there, it will go on and on and on and on. So it's somehow, and if you can do something that's cognitive, that just requires, even to counting sheep, but just something that just breaks that pattern, that can often be the easiest way of actually dealing with it.
So we've got a question here for each of you. Interested to know your personal day-to-day tips to cope with a lot of stress and to survive and thrive.
So I'm happy to go back, Anna, but feel free. So I have a number of things. Like Anna, I love doing physical challenges. They're not as anything like as brilliant as yours, Anna. I'm really impressed. But I do find that if I can do a physical challenge that I think I am incapable of doing, and I manage to achieve it, I then get confidence from that, and it makes me think, well, if I can cope with that, I can cope with anything that's happening in the workplace. So I do think that helps me anyway. A couple of other things. Sometimes I think it's really useful to just kind of take a moment and think, is this stress real? Or is it something that actually is just my perception of it? Really thinking about that. And is it a habitual response? Or if my partner does something that really irritates me or sets off my stress levels, is that just a habitual response? Or is there something I could actually sit back and think, you know what, in the great scheme of things, that's not really important. Reframing the emotion. So excitement and stress actually activate similar parts of the brain. And so sometimes, for example, if I've got to do a really sort of like a stressful, presentation in front of a CEO or board or something, rather than seeing it as being stressful, I see, you know what, this could be really exciting, actually. I'm going to see this as exciting. Reframing it as exciting, I then get all the benefits of that stress bit and less of the harmful bit. So reframing things then can be really helpful. Think of a solution, not the problem. Sometimes we dwell on what the problem is the whole time. Going into, well, I'm not going to think about the problem, let me think about solution. That gets the executive brain kind of kick-starting again, which is helpful. Always ask for help. Asking for help is actually a great way of helping reduce our stress levels. Or if you're really stressed, having compassion for somebody else and reaching out and doing something for somebody else really can also help reduce our stress levels, as can compassion meditation or compassion mindfulness. That really helps reduce the amygdala, that threat detector can really bring that down. A couple of other things, if it's an event that you're worrying about, maybe think about it when it's done. Imagine it, you know, sort of kind of like pre-create the outcome. So think about, you know, what you're going to see, feel, hear if it goes really, really well. And so it's that visualization that Anna was talking about. That is really, really helpful. If it's something you can practice, again, the brain doesn't distinguish between a practice and the real event. So if you've then got a keynote presentation or a difficult conversation that you're feeling stressed about, practice it with somebody in advance. And then when it actually comes to it, it will just be much more or less stressful because you've already dealt a lot with those stressful things in the practicing. And then the other thing I would say is consider this, consider the challenge from a distant perspective. So how am I going to feel about this in 5 years' time in the big picture? Is this really going to be something that's worth stressing over? Imagining yourself 5 years on and getting that sense of perspective, I find, again, particularly helpful to me. It's like, really, am I going to really think this is the biggest stressful thing in my life? Chances are not.
Anna, I've got to ask this one because I think it's a brilliant question. How can you design mini adventures to give yourself the opportunity to grow without having to go on holiday for weeks?
Oh, that's a good question, actually. I suppose work out, if you want to do something that's going to challenge you, work out where your comfort zone is, and then find ways to test that. So, for example, instead of going off on a really big adventure, you can go and spend a night sleeping under the stars, like spend a night literally sleeping under the stars on a hillside, particularly if that's not something that you are familiar with or comfortable with. You'll experience that same sort of challenge, overcoming possibly a fear if you've not slept out alone before, and you'll realize that actually you're capable of doing that. Finding those things that test your own comfort zone, because everyone's comfort zones are different. So a lot of people will look at the big expeditions that I do and think that is terrifying, whereas for me, my comfort zone is now being pushed quite extremely, so they are no longer terrifying for me. But bringing it back to what each person experiences and where their starting point is, you don't need to do massive things to get that adventure fix. For me, in the last sort of 6-7 months, an adventure has been traveling a couple of hours away, or not even that, just to experience a different sort of environment, a different landscape around me. I live by the sea. I spend a lot of time on the beach, and it's an adventure to go to the moors, for example, and get my adventure fix, packing my bag and preparing some lunch, and getting to sit up on the top of a tour, drinking a cup of coffee. That experiencing a different environment, that's worked for me while I've been stuck in one place.
And another one for you, Anna. How did the adventure coping mechanisms translate to more mundane stress, like getting a dissertation in? That's clearly from the heart from Emily Owen.
So one of the biggest stresses that I faced with my dissertation, so it was a sort of 18,000 word report, and at the start line of it, after I'd had like my ethics approval sorted, it just felt like this gargantuan, enormous task, and it was quite overwhelming at first, and I was like, where do I even begin with this? And I've experienced that with adventures and expeditions as well. With the kayaking one in particular, when Kate and I first started talking about doing it, it was this huge task. No one had done it before. It was 4,000 kilometers crossing the entire continent, and facing those two really big, overwhelming challenges is quite similar, even though they're in very different fields. And I have a saying, which I'm definitely going to completely misquote now, but start by doing what's necessary, then do what's possible, and then you are achieving the impossible. And that's what I always bring these things back to, is starting by just working out, what do I actually need to do in order to get anywhere with this? What are those first steps I have to take? So with my dissertation, I had to interview some people. That was quite a big step. If I wanted to be writing about what these people had experienced, I needed to talk to those people. So starting by doing those really necessary things, which then opens up the next steps that you can start to take. And before you know it, you're over 20,000 words in and you've got to cut down.
Now, this is the joy of the Alumnae Group, is our wide demographic. and I'll leave you to guess the demographic of this questioner, but do either of you have any tips on how to motivate 20-somethings to get off cortisol-raising and addictive screen-based activities and into more adventurous and career-developing, character-developing activities? Anna, do you want to go first?
Sorry, me. Sorry, do you want me to go first? So I missed some of the question. Was it how to get young people involved in adventure activities and away from their screens? Basically,
yes.
Yeah. So what's in it for them? You've got to appeal to what's in it for them, and each person will be different. But I bet you there is something about. I'm assuming this is the child of somebody on the call. There is something about that particular person that actually will find something rewarding about doing something outside, and you've just got to really frame it as what's in it for them about doing this. And if you can actually find that, you'll have them hiking mountains, doing kayaking, whatever it is. But you've got to focus on what the reward is, what's in it for them, not what the kind of like pain it isn't for them. So that's what I would focus on.
Yeah, continuing with that as well, focusing on what the intrinsic reward could be for them. So as Annie said, what isn't it for them? So trying to find something rather than giving them an extrinsic reward, so like an external thing. Intrinsic motivation, intrinsic reward is a much bigger predictor of success, whatever that success is to do with. So finding something that really, really relates to their own motivations, their own values, will give you a much better chance.
And also, some autonomy. So you could actually say, look, you know, being outdoors for part of the day is really, really good for your health, and I'm sure you want to be healthy. I'm going to let you decide what it is you want to do outdoors, but I really would like you to do something outdoors today rather than being on your screen. Having some autonomy over what that is also quite motivating for people too. Most people don't react very well to being told to doing something, but if you have some autonomy over the choice, that really helps.
So we've another one that kind of follows on quite nicely, which is, do you have any tips on how to help others, i.e. team members, friends, etc., cope with stress if they don't have self-awareness and resilience? I know you talked about teamwork. I mean, it's easy to say, but it's much harder to achieve. What's your approach?
So with Kate and I, we obviously faced quite a lot of stress together, but we experienced situations in a different way. So for example, Kate might have found a particular situation more stressful than I did. So the first thing there was I had to recognize the signs that she was stressed, and vice versa. Everything that I say definitely applies to me from her perspective as well. So recognizing that the other person is stressed, and working out if there are ways that you can help with the thing that is causing that stress without bringing stress onto yourself as well, because you're not going to be any use to the other person if you yourself are then just carrying all of that stress. And sometimes that is just like a listening ear, giving that person an opportunity to talk through it. The process of talking through a challenge or something that is causing stress is so helpful. So giving them that opportunity and not making them feel bad for feeling stressed or needing to turn to you, I think is really important. I feel like there's something else I was going to say then that I've instantly forgotten. Yeah, I think it's important not to bring the burden onto yourself. I think that is quite key. You kind of have to set those boundaries so that it's clear that you're able to help that person without just bringing yourself down as well, because you're an important member of that team.
Annie, there's a good question here, which is, having felt very resilient in the past, various events over recent years have reduced my resilience significantly. Is it possible to get it back?
Definitely, and we all have setbacks, we all do. But I think, you know, if things haven't gone as well as they have done, don't think of them as being failures. Look at them and think, well, that maybe didn't go as well as I thought it might, but what can I learn from that? You know, failure is the best learning that we can ever have. We never learn from the things that we do well. We never learn from those. We learn from the things that go less well. So what I would try and do is think about the things that perhaps haven't gone so well. What can I learn from those, and take those further forward? And then to build the resilience, particularly if it's a work situation, I would look to do something at work that is a bit out of your comfort zone, is a bit challenging, but make sure that you've got the right support to help you achieve it. And then take on that challenge with the support. And then when you have achieved it, that again will help build that resilience. But it's really important to make sure you've got the support around you to help you do that. And if you do that a couple of times, you will find that your resilience will build again.
Nice practical one now, Anna, for you. How do you ensure safety on your adventures, particularly as a woman travelling solo?
Oh, I get this so often, and it very, very often comes down to being a woman as well, which I find very interesting. I'm just going to touch on that briefly before I get into the safety stuff. A lot of people assume that being a woman in these environments means that I am more open to danger and risk. But my experience of that, and having spoken to so many other female adventurers as well, it actually works in completely the other way. The kayaking trip that Kate and I did, for example, because we were two young women, people felt they wanted to protect us and look after us more. So because of that, we were given so much more support. We got to sleep on people's boats. People invited us for dinner. They let us camp in their gardens. People really, really looked out for us in a way that they don't for men. And I know this, having spoken to people who have done similar trips on the Danube. So that's my first point. Also, the remote trips that I do, sort of in wilderness areas, nature and wildlife don't differentiate between human genders, so it's a very relevant factor. In terms of more practical safety measures, for tracks that I do, I carry what's called a Garmin. So it's a GPS tracker that has an SOS button. So if things do go really wrong, I can hit the SOS button and get rescued, generally by a helicopter, for the locations that I am on for those trips. I've also done mountain courses, both summer and winter, so I go into them with a quite high level of skill. So actually, the chance of ending up in those risky situations is reasonably low. That's one of those factors that I've been able to control for. And I've got good equipment with me should things go wrong. I know that I've got a really good tent that I can put up in pretty much any conditions and get that shelter. I always have enough food, have extra food in case I have to hole up in my tent for days on end, things like that. And for the kayaking trip, when we were kayaking around the Kent coast, for example, we had PLBs, or personal locator beacons. So again, if we capsized or we started getting pushed out to sea, we could just sort of release these and trigger a response. Yeah, hopefully that answers the question.
Thank you. Tips for procrastination. Currently unemployed and on the hunt for my first graduate role, and the stress tends to lead to avoiding and procrastinating.
Oh no, I need answers to this. I am a queen procrastinator.
Right, it's been delegated to you, Annie.
I find procrastination happens to me, particularly when I'm telling myself to do something. I'm like, Annie, you've got to do this, right? So one of the things that that sometimes works is rather than telling yourself to do something, asking yourself, would you like to do it? So it's like parents, if they tell you to do something, it's like the hackles go up. It's like, if someone asks you to do something, you're much more sort of thoughtful and mindful about it. So actually asking yourself. So I moved house and I had all these boxes in this room that I just could not face dealing with. I just didn't want to. I kept putting off. I kept telling myself I had to do it, and then I decided, you know, again, having found this out on the neuroscience that I've been doing, I'm going to ask myself, after that, Annie, would you like to do the boxes? And I actually thought, yeah, I really do, actually. And somehow that kind of motivated me more towards it. The other thing too is, again, as I think I said earlier, is don't see something as a problem, try and think of the solution. So if I kept thinking of, oh my God, these boxes, I have no idea where I'm going to put the stuff. I haven't got enough room. Oh, I'm just going to leave them in the boxes. You know, I kept seeing it as the problem. Whereas when I approached it as, hang on a minute, what's the solution here? Well, there actually might be some things in here that are actually really useful for me to have right now. I should open every box, and maybe I'll keep some of them in the boxes, but I could maybe put them in another space and at least make sure there's room. So I started to come up with solutions. And when you come up with solutions, what happens in the brain is you're more driven towards something rather than avoiding it. So procrastination is about avoiding something. What you need to do is, and it's your right prefrontal cortex that's doing that basically. So what you need to do is shift the thinking over to the left side, and you do that by finding reasons as to why it would make you more wanting to do it. And things like the solutions, asking yourself to do it, can all be helpful when it comes to procrastination. Just try, see if it works for you.
I'm dying to try that because I am an arch procrastinator, and I know I'm doing it when the ironing gets really attractive.
The other thing is to think of, is to again think of yourself in the future. How will I feel if I've done this task? So imagine yourself, but you have to really, really imagine yourself. So you really have to think, what am I going to see? What am I going to hear? What am I going to smell? What am I going? It's got to be really visceral. Again, if you can really do that, that then draws you more towards taking action.
Now, I am procrastinating here because we were due to finish at 7. I've let this overrun because the questions have been fantastic. So firstly, thank you to all our questioners. Apologies if I missed any. I did try and scoop up themes, if not total questions. But I hope you all agree with me that we have had a really stimulating and fascinating session. And I'm sure everybody will have found a thread or a comment that will have made them just think slightly differently and hopefully rather more positively. I think I've often said that if it doesn't kill you, it makes you stronger. I think actually both of you have proved that that is a very true adage. I think we're getting a little bit of a plug for book.
It's not my book. It's a book by Professor Kelly McGonigal, and it's actually called The Upside of Stress. And it's actually a really, really good book. I commend it to people. It's very easy to read, but it's got some fascinating things in it too. So if you really want to read this further, I recommend that book. Or she's got a good TED talk. That's the other thing you can look at. Excellent.
Thank you for that. Now, this session has been recorded and will be available on YouTube. So if you want a reprise of some of the chat, please feel free to pick it up. And of course, if there's anybody you feel would benefit from it, please feel free to share it. We are very, very happy to share, and we're quite happy if it's not just to Exeter alumni. We'll talk to men and we'll talk to people who weren't wise enough to go to Exeter as well. So please share. We have 3 more sessions coming up on the screen. You can see the dates. We hope they're very topical, and obviously please feel free to join, even if they don't fit you exactly, because maybe your questions can help people in there. And as I say, we're really keen to have you all join us through the LinkedIn group. If you look for Exeter Alumnae, you will find us there. And you'll find it a very supportive and engaging network, both sharing information, but actually lending a hand and a little bit of expertise. So I do commend it to all of you. Finally, a few thank yous to Dave and the rest of the alumni team. Huge thank you for getting us all mobilised. But an enormous thanks to Georgie, who is part of our committee, but is an absolute whiz and does this for a living, but has done all the heavy lifting for this evening and actually keeping us organised and disciplined. So many thanks, Georgie. Many thanks everyone who's been here, and particular thanks to Annie and Anna for launching our series. Look forward to seeing everyone again. Many thanks.
Thanks, Liz.